The first day of the Somme, 60,000 casualties in hours. July 1st, 1916. In a few hours, 20,000 men would be dead. Most wouldn't make it past their own barbed wire. They didn't know it yet. The waiting. Northern France. A 25-mile stretch of rolling farmland, forests, and shattered villages. The largest army Britain had ever assembled waited in silence. In the trenches, men checked watches. Officers checked maps. Runners waited for whistles. For 7 days and nights, the earth had not stopped shaking. Some men wrote letters home. Some cleaned rifles they would never fire. Some prayed. Some slept, exhausted by the noise. The youngest soldiers were 18 years old. Many had never left their villages before enlisting. Now they sat in mud, waiting for dawn, listening to the endless drumbeat of artillery that promised to end the war. The confidence. Beginning on June 24th, British and French artillery opened fire in what commanders believed would be a war-ending blow. By the morning of July 1st, more than 1.7 million shells had been fired. It was the heaviest bombardment in history. Villages vanished, ridges collapsed, fields became moonscapes. The noise could be heard in London, 140 miles away. Soldiers in the trenches stuffed cloth in their ears and still felt their skulls vibrate. The ground rippled like water. Trees snapped like matchsticks. For days the horizon glowed orange at night from the muzzle flashes of thousands of guns firing in unison. British generals believed the German front line had ceased to exist. One senior officer told his staff the infantry would face little more than mopping up. Staff officers spoke of walking into empty trenches, of finding only corpses and rubble, of encountering no resistance worth mentioning. Men were told the wire would be gone, the trenches flattened, the defenders dead. Some units were instructed to advance at a walking pace, rifles unloaded, bayonets fixed. They were told to carry extra equipment, shovels, sandbags, wire cutters, grenades, because they would be consolidating captured ground, not fighting for it. Some soldiers carried 60 pounds of gear. One soldier wrote home the night before, "We go over tomorrow. They say it will be easy." They were not being reckless. They were being logical, according to everything the army believed about artillery. The doctrine was clear, the math was convincing, the confidence was absolute. The assumption. British doctrine held that prolonged shelling would destroy trenches, cut barbed wire, kill defenders, break morale. On paper, the numbers supported this belief. Never in history had so much firepower been concentrated in one place. Never had an army been subjected to such punishment. Surely nothing could survive. In reality, the shells were wrong. Much of the British ammunition was shrapnel, designed to burst above ground and kill exposed troops, not destroy fortifications. Shrapnel was useless against concrete and earth. What they needed was high explosive shells, and they didn't have enough. Even worse, many of the shells were duds. Britain's factories, overwhelmed by demand, had rushed production. Quality control collapsed. Some estimates suggest that 1 in 3 shells failed to explode. They buried themselves harmlessly in the mud. German engineers had anticipated bombardment. They had studied the siege warfare of previous centuries. They knew artillery could kill men in the open, but not men underground. They had gone deep. The German defense. The German army on the Somme had spent 18 months preparing. They built deep dugouts, some descending more than 30 feet below the surface, reinforced with timber, steel, and concrete. Some dugouts had multiple rooms, electric lights, ventilation shafts, bunks with mattresses. Officers had private quarters. Medical stations were established underground. Ammunition was stored in reinforced chambers. Machine guns were positioned with interlocking fields of fire, calculated with mathematical precision. When the bombardment began, German infantry climbed down, lit cigarettes and waited. They played cards. They wrote letters. They listened to the thunder above and felt the earth shake and knew they were safe. One German officer later wrote, "We slept, the earth trembled, but we were safe." Another wrote home, "They waste their shells. We sit below and wait. When they come, we will be ready." When the shelling lifted on the morning of July 1st, they climbed back up. Their trenches were damaged, but intact. Their wire was damaged, but intact. Their machine guns were ready. They set up their weapons. They loaded ammunition belts. They watched the British trenches and waited for the whistles. 0 hour. At 7:20 a.m., 10 minutes before the infantry assault, British engineers detonated enormous mines beneath German positions. The largest, Lochnagar, lifted nearly 500,000 tons of earth into the air. The explosion created a crater 300 feet across and 90 feet deep. It is still visible today. Observers cheered. They believed the Germans were finished. The Germans adjusted their machine guns. At 7:28 a.m., the British artillery shifted its fire deeper into German territory, lifting off the front line to strike rear positions and prevent reinforcements. This was the plan. This was the signal. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew along 25 miles of trench. Over 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches. The walk. They advanced as ordered, in long lines, shoulder to shoulder, at a measured pace. Some units kicked footballs forward to steady nerves. Others sang. Officers walked openly, leading from the front, carrying only pistols and walking sticks. They wore their rank insignia. They expected silence. They expected to walk across empty ground. Instead, they were met by machine guns. The sound was described as ripping cloth, continuous, mechanical, inescapable. One survivor later wrote, "It was like a scythe cutting wheat. Men simply fell. There was no fighting, just falling." The first waves were cut down before they had walked 10 yards. Some men never made it out of their own trenches. They were shot climbing the ladders. Others made it 5 yards, 10 yards, 20 yards. And then they fell. The machine gun reality. The German MG-08 was a weapon built for this exact moment. It fired 500 rounds per minute. It did not overheat easily. It was accurate, stable, and pre-sighted. German crews had spent weeks calculating fields of fire. They knew the exact distance to landmarks. They knew where British trenches were. They knew the paths men would take. Fields of fire overlapped so that no ground was safe. Gunners did not aim at individual men. They swept areas. They fired in long, methodical bursts. Entire waves were cut down in seconds. German crews fired until barrels glowed red, then swapped them and continued. Spare barrels were kept ready. Ammunition was stacked in boxes beside each gun. Water jackets kept weapons cool. The geometry of death was perfect. British soldiers had no answer. They could not charge faster. They were already dying. They could not take cover. There was none. They could not retreat. Orders forbade it. So they walked forward, and they died. Beaumont-Hamel. At Beaumont-Hamel, the Newfoundland Regiment advanced across open ground overlooked by German positions. They had no cover. The ground sloped upward toward German lines. Every step took them into clearer view. Machine guns opened fire from 3 directions. Within minutes, the regiment ceased to exist as a fighting force. Out of 801 men, only 68 answered roll call the next day. Most never reached the German wire. Many never made it halfway. Some fell within sight of their own trenches. One officer survived because he was wounded in the first seconds and fell into a shell crater. He lay there all day, listening to men scream. By afternoon, the screaming stopped. The Newfoundland regiment had been destroyed in less than 30 minutes. It would take years to rebuild. Serre and Thiepval. At Serre, British units were destroyed so quickly that German defenders later reported running out of targets. They had fired so many rounds that ammunition had to be brought forward from reserve stocks. At Thiepval, men reached the German wire and found it untouched. The bombardment had barely scratched it. They stood trapped, silhouetted against the skyline, fumbling with wire cutters. Machine guns fired until no one remained standing. Bodies piled against the wire. Later waves advanced over the corpses of earlier waves. At some points, the dead were stacked 3 deep. Communication collapse. By 8 a.m., the battlefield was chaos. Telephone lines were cut by shellfire. Runners were killed trying to carry messages. Smoke obscured everything. Commanders in rear positions had no idea what was happening. They saw men advancing. They did not see them falling. Initial reports were optimistic. Advancing as planned. Light resistance. Objective secured. These reports were wrong. They were based on what observers thought they saw, or hoped they saw, through smoke and distance. Higher command believed progress was being made. Orders to continue the assault went out. Reserve units were committed. More men went forward. They walked into the same machine gun fire. They died in the same ways. The Ulster Division. At the Schwaben Redoubt, the 36th Ulster Division achieved one of the few real breakthroughs of the day. They advanced quickly, using speed and aggression instead of the slow walking pace. They overran German trenches and reached objectives thought unreachable. For a moment, success seemed possible, but there were no reserves to support them. The units on their flanks had been destroyed. They were alone, surrounded, cut off. German artillery closed in, firing on coordinates they knew by heart. The survivors tried to hold. They fought hand-to-hand in captured trenches. They ran out of ammunition. They withdrew, or died where they stood. Success, isolated, became failure. By nightfall, the Schwaben Redoubt was back in German hands. The field by midday. By noon, the battlefield was covered with bodies. Thousands of men lay in no man's land. The wounded lay screaming, then whimpering, then silent. Medics crawled forward under fire, trying to reach them. Most medics were shot. Some wounded men tried to crawl back to British lines. Most didn't make it. They bled out in shell craters. The sun rose higher. The heat became unbearable. Men cried for water. No one came. The attacks continued through the afternoon. New orders, new objectives, new men, same result. The numbers. By nightfall, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were casualties. Almost 20,000 would never go home. The rest were wounded, missing, or captured. The German army, fighting from prepared defences, lost roughly 8,000 men. It was the bloodiest day in British military history. To put this in perspective, Britain lost more men in one day than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. Entire battalions had been wiped out. Some villages in Britain lost every man of fighting age. The telegram deliveries began the next day. Mothers answered doors. Postmen handed over envelopes. Regret to inform you. Some families received multiple telegrams. Brothers killed together. Why it continued. The Somme offensive did not stop. It could not stop. Verdun was bleeding France dry. The French had begged Britain to attack, to draw German divisions away from Verdun, where hundreds of thousands of men were dying in a battle of attrition that had lasted months. Russia was collapsing on the Eastern Front. Britain had to act. The strategic situation left no choice. Commanders believed attrition favored the Allies. Germany had fewer men, less industry, less access to global resources, less time. Every German casualty was irreplaceable. Every British casualty could be replaced, from the Empire, from volunteers, eventually from conscription. They believed the math would work, eventually. Cold logic. Merciless calculation. The dead were numbers in ledgers. 4 months of grinding. The battle continued until November 1916. The tactics evolved slowly. Artillery became more precise. Infantry learned to advance in smaller groups. Tanks appeared for the first time in history, crude, unreliable, but terrifying to those who faced them. By the end, over 1 million total casualties, British, French, German, Allied advance, 6 miles. No decisive breakthrough. No collapse of German lines. No end to the war. But the German army was exhausted. Its best units had been destroyed. Its reserves were gone. The professional army that had marched into Belgium in 1914 no longer existed. The attritional logic, cold, merciless, began to work. But the cost was beyond comprehension. The legacy. July 1st, 1916 ended an era. It proved courage could not defeat firepower. Artillery quantity meant nothing without accuracy. The machine gun ruled the battlefield. Doctrine written in peacetime failed in industrial war. It forced armies to adapt. Better coordination between artillery and infantry. Creeping barrages that moved ahead of attacking soldiers. Infiltration tactics using small groups instead of long lines. Tanks to break wire and cross trenches. Close air support. All born from the blood of the Somme. The lessons were written in corpses. The final truth. The men who walked forward that morning were not foolish. They were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They did exactly what they were trained to do. They followed orders. They trusted their commanders. They believed in their cause. The failure was not theirs. The war had changed faster than doctrine. Generals trained in colonial warfare commanded armies in industrial slaughter. Tactics designed for open battlefields collided with trenches, wire, and machine guns. And on the first day of the Somme, an entire generation learned that industrial war does not reward bravery. It consumes it. The courage was real. The sacrifice was immense. The tragedy was that neither mattered. By nightfall, the British Army had lost more men in any day before or since. Families would mourn for decades. Villages would erect memorials listing names, too many names for the stone to hold. And the battle was just beginning. The Somme would grind on for 4 more months. But July 1st, 1916 stands alone. A day when hope died in hours. When an army walked into fire and did not come back. When the modern world learned what war had become. We remember them not because they won. We remember them because they went. And that is enough.